Alrighty, good evening, everybody, or I guess late afternoon, whatever you would describe it. My name is Scott. I'm a technical artist with Studio 369, and today we're back again with Noble Legacy, but today it's going to be a little bit of a different stream, and where in our previous ones, go ahead and adjust the volume levels. In our previous ones, we were doing streams kind of showing the kind of a quote-unquote shipped build early on for what we're having as like our early releases, and today we're kind of taking more of a look at the kind of the behind the scenes of it there. We're kind of been asked to show more of a focus of a kind of what's always put into making Noble Legacy and any other game development project for that. Something that I don't think a lot of people really get a chance to see, and for some of you might find it interesting. So we'll go over a couple of different examples of just kind of showing how things are made, like that old show on Discovery or whatever, how it's made, but just kind of a game edition, if you will. So we go ahead and just test volume levels one more time. Seems good. All right, so let's go ahead and I guess we'll jump right into it. Again, we'll kind of do this for about an hour or so today. Kind of see it's getting kind of late, but let's go ahead and jump right into it here. So for what I normally focus on in my day-to-day work when I'm not asked to do these live streams and show the games for you is I technically I'm a technical artist, so what that role means per studio is a little bit different. In general, it's just meaning I'm basically the bridge between art and programming. And what that means exactly is I would handle the art assets, wherever they are procured from, whether I make them or some other artist on the team makes them. And then it's typically my job to figure out the best way to have those integrated into the engine that both achieves the artistic vision of the project while also keeping performance on the forefront the whole time, because you don't want a game that runs super sloppy, even if it is beautiful, but if it's not performant, then no one's gonna really care. So with that balance, that's the general statement. But what tech artists can really do in it's hard to put it in words. I guess I could say it's a broad niche. It's a very in-demand job for wherever you would look in the industry because of its technical skills that are involved with it, and just of how diverse the amount of and varied work you'll be doing with there, where you can have tech artists that are focused on rigging, or more tech artists that are more focused on visual effects, handling files, really anything you can think of that is art related. The characters or the technical artists will be able to handle pretty much anything that is thrown their way. So there are some specializations, but it's just kind of good to have a wide variety of stuff to pick from. So for right now, let's go into one example of one of the things I had to work on, which was today for a weapon that we use in there, which is a bow and arrow. So we needed a when the character shoots a bow, let me go ahead and we load up the map here. I had all the map files in here. So we have a character that's going to be shooting bow and arrow, and we want to have kind of a visual tracer behind there so you can kind of see the direction of the flight of the arrow, where it's going. And with that, there's a couple of things you have to kind of keep in mind in here. One is, what is the overall artistic goal? Obviously, the end result is we want to be able to see the arrow, but you have to ask in the what does your project look like? Is it stylized? Is it realistic? What's the art style that you're going for? And for us, we're kind of going for a semi-realistic because, obviously you're not going to be able to see, arrows, having a tracer for real in real life. That's not what it is. But on the other hand, so it's okay to kind of deviate a bit from reality from that moment. But if you're in something that's a little bit more stylized per se, then there's, you can have a lot more leniency in terms of kind of having a creative direction of where you want to go with it. So let's see, we're loaded into our kind of a showcase map here. So it kind of just has a couple of, kind of placed village. This is probably kind of like a mid to, later part of the game of where you have, more built up buildings and materials. It's not just all wooden structures. We kind of have some more brick structures, and we even have kind of like a stone cathedral over here. So a little bit more advanced building, so a fair bit more developed. So going into here, I need to actually place a target in here because our system needs to basically pick a target to be able to shoot at. And let's just otherwise we won't be able to target anything, so we need a dummy. There we go. So we have like a little practice dummy in there. That's fine. And then we're gonna raise it up a little bit because at least I know with my testing with this is that the targeting point has been a little bit lower on this mesh. So I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of raise it up a little bit, so it's gonna look a little funky in the air. Actually, we'll do a half measure. We'll kind of put it here, and then we're kind of gonna spawn around in here. So we just hit play to start up the editor in Pi. This will be it. Yeah, that's fine. And go ahead and get this loaded up here. We'll see how slow load times are between multi-streaming and doing this at the same time, because it's good to have a fast CPU for all of this. And hopefully no crashes, but it's the editor, so it can be as unpredictable sometimes as you think it could be. All right, so we're in here, and you can kind of see that for the most part, it runs just like it would, at runtime for if it were a ship build. Obviously, we're not going to be as performant, but not bad. Able to test things. So obviously, going to pull up our bow and arrow here. So the end result of what I was trying to go for today was this. It's kind of a simple, little bit of a wisp of a trail that kind of falls behind the arrow where you shoot. We go ahead and kind of get out of the trees there, but there you go. So yeah, very simple. You see it just enough, but it's not overly distracting, at least in my opinion. And it kind of guides your eye to the movement of where it's going. Without it, which I can actually show you here. This here. So if I go into it, where is it? There it is. It's this smart object here. So when you have when you're trying to add particles to something, there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. For what we have in our system here, we're using a projectile system, so we have a physical object that's traveling through space. It's not a hit scan where it's a ray being casted and then it determines the point of impact and the damage calculated instantaneously. It's you shoot something, it travels for a bit, and then it gets to its target, and then damage is calculated. Everything's got a collision and a hitbox and a hurtbox to make sure everything is calculated on the point of impact, and things travel through physical space. So with this, I guess in summary, think of it kind of like Apex Legends. All the weapons, all the bullets kind of, they don't exactly get to their target. It takes a little bit of time to get there. So with this, you have a couple of different options of what you can do with with attaching a particle system to there. In other systems, you can normally have kind of a how to describe it, a socket. There we go. A socket attached onto the parent object here, which I believe this arrow, or let me show you on the other one that didn't quite work out here, but it's a different blueprint. So if we go to the mesh over here, it's not point. Yeah, here we are. So this is the actual static mesh of the object here, and you can see that there are two sockets attached to it, one at the beginning, one at the end, for trail 1 and trail 2. And you can normally use these for either attaching a particle system directly to it, or you can use the differential between the beginning and the ending one to kind of limit the length of your trail. So you can say, like, all right, start drawing it at point 1 and end it, at point 2. But for me, we could do a little bit simpler, and where I kind of knew the velocity of what the arrow was going to be, and I can kind of tailor make the effects for that. So the first thing is that we're going to really, before we can even make a particle effect, is that you would need a material for that particle effect. So basically, the idea of this is that we're going to attach a particle system. Let's see if I can, let's say this is the arrow here. So we're going to attach, and this is the point of it. So we're going to attach a particle system at the back side of it. And this is going to be a specific type of particle system that basically known as a ribbon material. And that ribbon, you know, think of if you were to attach like some sort of a cloth to the back of an arrow. As this moves forward, it kind of, you know, draws the path behind there. So if you were to attach a cloth to it, it would kind of like get caught in the wind, and then you would, you know, your eye would kind of catch that more. So that's the idea of what we're going to use with a ribbon material here. And where a ribbon material is, it's a type of particle sprite, if you will, but it's typically in a line. And with this, you can set up usually gradients of where you can have more visibility at one end, and then it kind of trails off behind it. And these are great for many different applications, like for having trails behind something. So for arrows here, or if you're trying to do like light bikes in Tron, you know, that's that's almost like a literal like ribbon material. You know, those cool little the light bikes or whatever, you know, with their trail that they draw. You can use a ribbon material for that as well. You know, anything that needs to kind of follow the general shape of something. So with that, I'm going to go over to the material over here, and this is Unreal's material editor here. And it may seem daunting at first, but it's actually fairly simple. So with Unreal, everything is made in nodes, and it's node-based programming. The base programming for all things in Unreal is C++, but there is a kind of easier layer of representation of that code called Blueprint. So you could, with anything in any of these Blueprint coding, you could write it in C++. So with all this, if we go back over to the material editor here, there are different nodes available for different aspects of what you're trying to do in Unreal. You can think of these as libraries. If you're saying like Unity or whatever, you need to load the Unity library in order to be able to access to certain code. Otherwise, if you're trying to, you know, write in C#, which is what Unity is based in, it's not going to know what a rigid body is or whatever, or anything else that's specific to Unity without loading in the Unity library, you know, right at the top of the your, you know, introductory classes. It's kind of a similar thing with this, in that in different coding parts of this. So like the material editor, the Blueprint editor, they all use Blueprint, but they all recognize different code. So for example here, if I'm going to write, you know, depth fade, which is a kind of effect node that we would use typically, which I'll explain here a little bit, it's going to know what it is over here in the material editor. But if I go over to, say, the blueprint projectile and I type in depth fade, it's going to be casting to the basically the material editor, because it doesn't know what that is, but it knows where it can get that from, basically. So anyway, go ahead and delete that. What's up, Lich Queen? Long time no see. Hope you're doing well. So with all this, let's go ahead and take a look into the material itself. Now, you would basically not have any of this. This would be your only node when you're starting out here in a when you're making a material. And with this, you would have already have named it. So you would go into you would basically make your material. So I'll just go in my dev folder here, and you would just go right click and then material, make a material, you name it, you open it up, and this is all that you would get. So this is kind of the central node of every material is going to have when you first create it. And you're going to see that a lot of these kind of input nodes that are in here are kind of blacked out. And the reason for that is not all materials are the same. You know, they're for different purposes. You know, what are we describing? Are we describing a surface? Are we describing a post-process material? Is it opaque? Is it translucent? Should this object receive lighting from the directional light or other lights in the scene? Is it casting light? You know, these are all questions that you should basically ask yourself when you're making these, and then apply them to you know, what you're trying to make. So by default, it usually will go to this, which is a surface opaque default lit material. And you can see a lot more of the nodes here just kind of lit up. This is what you normally get. And this is what we would use if we're trying to describe a surface object. So basically you can see it's a surface type. So that's the domain. And there's other ones here like deferred decal, light function, volumes, post-process. Don't really need to worry about those right now. For what we're trying to do with our arrow here, we're basically describing a surface. The surface happens to be, you know, wind, you know, essentially, you know, kind of a disturbance in that wind, but it's still a surface that we're describing. So it's a surface. And then we could do it opaque, but it's going to be way too bright looking. You know, we want to be able to kind of see through it, or at least have it be not so jarring to look at. So typically we're going to pick a translucent material here, or you could also do additive, but we're not really trying to have it kind of cast any light. So we want it to kind of be able to just see through it. I'm just on one today. So we're going to click translucent here, and then under the shading model, you can see we're already kind of getting to where we were before we plugged in all of our code here. So the last is the shading model, and this is one of the more important ones, I guess you could say, in terms of how the inputs are added into the master node to determine the final output of the material. So default lit is basically this object can receive light from the directional sources, and then it's going to basically cast a shadow, you know, as a result of that. We don't want that here because, again, it's essentially wind. We're not going to see the wind, and we don't want to receive light, and we generally don't want to cast any light either, because again, it's just meant to be visible enough, but almost like heat ripples, but a little bit more visible than that. So out of all these options, we're going to go with unlit here. And your choices in these materials as well also introduce different costs. So again, going back to the other side of technical art stuff, and where basically you have to think that every time you add something, if you were to create a entirely new project with nothing inside of it, every time you add something into there, there's a cost. There is nothing cheaper than rendering nothing at all. So every time you add something, there is a cost. It may be a minute cost, but there's a cost to it. So you always have to make decisions on what to add, how much to add, and how far can you really take it. So with this with this shading model in here, Unlit happens to be a cheaper shading model, and we can just think of this logically in terms of, well, I don't have to plug in any of these other nodes to describe what this is going to look like. So there's just less instructions overall, which you can also see represented down here. If I were to go to default lit, this would basically be more than it would otherwise. Now we do lose a little bit of that because translucency is fairly expensive versus just rendering an object, because not only do you have to draw that object itself, but you have to also draw the objects behind it as well, and kind of apply almost like a filter over it. So there's extra cost to it to consider. But moving on from there, we also checked this box here for two-sided. So what that means, I can kind of show you here, is you see how you kind of lose it on one side and you don't really see it on the other. So we have this is being represented by a sphere here, but basically it would draw the outside of the sphere with the effect, but if you were to somehow see through it on the inside, you wouldn't be able to see anything. So we want to be able to see the inside of it, because our ribbon material, which you have to keep in mind, it's going to be basically kind of like a square. So it's going to be kind of very flat. And if we were to do one-sided, it would say draw the palm of my hand, but it wouldn't draw the back side of it. So we want to be able to see it on both sides. So we want two-sided. So we're going to do that. And going into the other code here, let's break it down. So with the emissive color here, there's only basically 2 to 3 nodes that are available when you're using translucent unlit materials. You have emissive color, opacity, and world position offset. Emissive color, you can think of it as, well, it's good to describe it as colors which parts of your material will appear to glow, and generally this is true. This is also an available option when you're using default lit objects, and where it's going to basically give the value of the color whatever you give it and kind of make it bright. We don't want it to be bright in this case, but you could do that as an option if you're doing it for a different material. So instead of that, so we have to use this here, but we're basically going to tone down the intensity of it, where if I were to plug in, for example here, let me just do, I'm going to create a vector 3 here. Everything that you see here is basically a bunch of math. You see I didn't add in a color node or whatever, I added in a vector 3 node. There's a lot of shortcuts in here. I just used by pressing 3 and left clicking on the mouse, that makes it, but you can also go into this kind of search function, I can't think of the name of it, by right clicking and then basically search for the node you want. So if we wanted to find particle color, we can just go particle color, and it's pretty good at guessing what you're trying to fill in there, so it'll kind of auto fill. Well, let me use the color here. So if I go into, say, something like blue, or let's do something bright, let's do like a yellow. I plug that in there, it's going to turn this yellow. So it's basically taking this color and then it's comparing it with all this other, basically this other math that we're doing over here. But if I really want to make it glow, I can increase its value using super color. So right now it's at 1, but if I go to like 5, now it's a lot brighter, and you can really see kind of that contrast in the opacity. Excuse me. You can see that contrast in the opacity between the bright yellow and then the nothingness, the translucent part. So again, we don't necessarily want that, but you can make it ridiculously bright. If I go to like 500, it's gonna be like blind, yeah, like glowing like the sun. You can really see it's a very harsh line now versus if I were to go to like 0.5. It's gonna be a lot more gradual and smooth. So go ahead and delete that, put that back in there. And we use vectors in here because, again, it's all math, and where we have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. And if you're thinking in terms of, you know, if we were doing 8-bit color or 8-bit color, 16-bit color, you know, there's no 8-bit color. There's 256 values that you can pick from between red, green, and blue. And when you have all this together, that gets like 16.7 million colors. And you use those to, you know, you can have some pretty subtle gradients and all there. HDR, you know, it's going to be greater colors. You know, that uses a higher color depth than 8-bit. We're getting a little off track here. So, you know, use colors here to describe the emissive color. And if we use a vector 3, we could just set it to one color and it will always be that. And for the most part, for the arrow, that's generally what it's going to be. I kind of want it to be kind of a white to kind of represent air, more or less. So I could technically use a constant, but I want to be able to give the option that it can be easily changed from within the particle system that we make. Because again, this material is going to be referenced and used in the particle system. So instead of using a constant, I'm going to use this particle color node. And this is an input node that you can see here, an input data node. And you can hold into the extra details by holding Control Alt. So it's the particle color expression ties into the current color of a given particle based on any per particle color data defined within Cascade or Niagara. This may be put into the appropriate channel emissive color. So what that basically means is that within the particle system that we are working within, we can determine the colors there instead of having to determine them in the material editor. So, and there's different nodes here. So we're going to have our red, green, and blue colors together. We could have them separately if we want to do some, you know, interesting masking of colors. But we want them all together because, you know, red, green, and blue make up the entire spectrum. And so whatever color we want, we're going to need all those channels. And then the alpha is going to be, alpha is basically, you can think of it kind of like opacity, but it is determining the kind of the translucency of it. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's going to be calculated into our opacity node down here. And down here is where it gets to the more interesting maths with all this. So again, so if I were to, let me put opacity to just 1 here, just to show you. So this is basically just gonna be a solid ball. And while we could just go in here and this would, you know, probably look decently okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit apply and update the material here. And then we go back into our test level. You're gonna see that it'll look okay, but it's going to be like really noticeable compared to what it was before. So let's go ahead and get this booted up in here. All right, and I open up my bow and let's head over to the Sax here and target it and then shoot. Yeah, so you can really see the ribbon material here. So the ribbon is that kind of white, you know, ribbon looking like square that's kind of trailing behind it, and you can really see the trail behind it now. And you know, depending upon the kind of game that you're going for, this could be all that you really need. If you're going for something, you know, really kind of stylized, kind of a lower poly look, this could work for you. Honestly, it's a little bit rough, you know. I don't particularly love seeing the hard edges, but like I said, that could be a look you're going for. But for us, this obviously isn't going to work. So we're gonna need to make a couple more adjustments here. So if I were to look at that, I would basically say it's too rough. I can basically see the edges of it, and it doesn't really blend in with the environment at all. It's really distracting. It's supposed to be eye-grabbing enough that you see it, but not so much that it pulls your whole focus away towards it. So it's something that almost like something catches you like at the corner of your glance or whatever, something like that. It needs to be a little bit more subtle. So going back into material here, we obviously need to add in some, more translucency here. So I have another node here, a kind of a parameter node. This one is describing a single number value, so a scalar parameter in this case. And we can go ahead and just plug this in here. So instead of it being at 1, I'm going to have it be at 20%, so 0.2 of its original value, because again, opacity is determined between 0 and 1. 0 is fully translucent and 1 is fully opaque, basically. So we're gonna have it around 20%, and already this should be a decent improvement here. It's not gonna do a lot against the edges, but it's gonna blend in a bit more. We're gonna see a bit more of the background behind it. So if we go ahead here and boot it back up, go into our bow, lock on. So we go over to the exaption spot where we were. And you can see this already looks a fair bit better. It's still a little bit rough around the edges. I can see a lot of sharp lines here, but it's blending a bit more. It's not as visually distracting as it was before. It's a bit more subtle, but there's more that we can do. So let's head back into the material editor here. And so with this, we need to do a couple of things here. One, the main issue is that it's too rough around the edges. So we need to make an adjustment on that. So one thing we can do is use something called a sphere mask. Now, sphere masks, excuse me, one sec. All right, sorry about that. So sphere mask, what we can use these for is basically it has just a couple of inputs in there: A, B, radius, and hardness. Now, A and B, you can think of these as 2 points of comparison. So whatever that comparison you want it to be. So if you were to, use, here's a point in space, here's another point in space. So now that's going to be the comparison point between the two. And then we have two other values of radius and hardness. So the radius is based on those points. How wide do you want that sphere to be if you have those 2 points? And then you have the hardness, which is basically the a blending or a feathering. So at lower values, it's a lot more feathered, and then at higher values, it's basically you can see like a fine line. It's a lot more contrasty. So for us, we want to blend those harsh edges. So what we can do is use this sphere mask here, and we have our radius and our hardness. Hardness, we want it again, we want to be really feathered. So we're going to have our radius. We're going to have our hardness at 0, excuse me. And then with our radius, we want to be really small. This is not a very large particle effect, so we're aiming at 0.5. And this is within Unreal's units, so you'll kind of have to play around with these a little bit, but you can get it pretty close. And then this node over here is our texture coordinate node. And what this node does is that all objects here, when we open up like a plane here. So kind of like how in school, you learn about graphs. So with all of these, we have an X and a Y point in space. You can see it down here by my gizmo, X in one direction, Y in another. And then in game programs, we have a Z axis as well, because we have to deal with, gravity and, up and down, moving forward, and side to side. So we have those 3 degrees of motion. And so basically we're kind of determining, and there's this UV tiling. So when we have any object, objects are going to have, let's see if I can open up the channel here. So is it UV1? Yeah, it's this one. So you can kind of see a representation of this arrow's UVs here, and we're between this space between x0 and y, x0 and x1 and y0 and y1, we have the arrow as if you were to kind of break it apart like a cardboard box and lay it flat. And all these areas here determine if you were to apply a texture to it, where it gets painted over on this object here. So that's why if you've ever seen, or maybe you've messed around in the editor yourself and where you've tried to apply a texture to something, like some other object's texture to something else, and it just kind of looks all, mismatched and not lined up. That's why. It's that the texture was designed with the UVs in mind of that object. So you kind of have to obey that, and it's a very important part if you're ever becoming a 3D modeler to learn, is you learning how to UV. So going back into our trail here, so basically what we want is that we want this center point. We want this to be the brightest part of our ribbon, because that's the main part that we care about. We don't want to see the edges. We want to see those feathered off. So we're going to pick the center point and then feather it out from there. So that's why we're picking 0.5, because 0.5 of X and 0.5 of Y, you're going to get that center point. And then with our hardness here, we want it to be really feathered. So we're going to put that at 0, and then we'll see a lot less contrast. So what I'm going to do here, I think we can just see it if I take off the opacity here and go back to the ball. So you can see we're already starting to get that kind of shape here. I think even on the plane, it should fade away. Yep. So here's our sphere. You can see it's the strongest in the center, and then it tapers away, because we picked that 0.5. Again, this was the square before, the plane, and we're tapering it off there. So, and if we let's go back to our ball, or excuse me, we'll put the ball here, and we'll go back to our testing area, and I will show you some notes here. Now I'll show you, this will look significantly better than before. So go ahead and clip our bow, go back over to where we've been testing, select that. And now we don't see those harsh edges anymore. It's a lot more subdued, and it has this kind of softness to it, which I like in particular. So this already here, it's feeling pretty good. Some notes that I would still have for it. Well, actually, let me put it in slow-mo, 0.1. So yeah, so we can really see the softness of it now. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so it's got this nice kind of roundness to it that I kind of like, especially, if you're imagining kind of the wind going through the, the tail end, like the feathers of the arrow itself. So it feels pretty good. But to me, it's just a little bit flat looking, so fire another arrow here. You can see it's just kind of just one note throughout. It's kind of bright white, and then it does fade away to kind of a bit more of a gray, but it feels very flat. And I kind of want to give it a little bit more depth to it. So if I go back to one, quit out of there, this leads into the next part here. So if I go to the back here, so you're going to see we have this depth fade node. And what is a depth fade node? Well, the description is the depth fade expression is used to hide unsightly seams that take place when translucent objects intersect with opaque ones. Yeah, this doesn't really explain a whole ton, but what it's trying to do is that basically there's two inputs into a depth fade node. You have opacity and the fade distance here, and both are important for determining the look that you're trying to go for. So let me plug everything back into the way that I had it here. and just kind of compare the difference. So if we're, here's 1, here's 2. So yes, it's softer, you know, that's because of our opacity here. But if I were to go back to, I don't know what the value would be determined as over there. It's whatever the alpha then is, so probably be pretty high. So let's say it's like a 0.8. It's getting a bit closer there. I think that's a little bit closer of a comparison. Yeah. See if I could find the best angle. So one part of it that you can use with the depth fade is intersection. So that way, when you have another object inside of your translucent area, it'll kind of blend it a bit better. So that, like if I were to kind of stick a stick through this right now, you would basically see where the ball shape comes over, and now we're to stick something through it. It would basically, without the depth fade node, it'll kind of have this harsh intersection where you would see the clear stick and then everything around it that's clearly not the stick. So we want to make that not happen. So there is going to be a point of where it's right at the back side of the arrow. So it's going to help in that regard. But the other thing that we want to do with it is that it just kind of helps make it look a bit more like it has depth. It's really no other way to really describe it here. So we can describe the fade distance here. So it's the world space distance over which the fade should take place. So how far in Unreal units is the object going to be, is that fade, like the gradient? You're determining a gradient. So if I make it, you know, more, it'll be kind of a bit more of a gradient. And if I make it lower, it'll be a bit more harsh. It's hard to see in the editor, but it does make a tangible difference. So if I go back down to our 0.2 here where I had it before and hit apply, and this is kind of getting near the final where I had it before, because again, it was still a little bit too bright in my opinion. So if I put this back at 0.8, so it's kind of similar to the brightness it was before. We go back into our level here. Open up our bow and go back over and target. It's gonna look mostly the same, but to me it doesn't appear as flat. And that's thanks to our depth fade node here that we have. Now, to me, this is getting close to final. And it's not just because I know that there's only one last thing I have to do, but my biggest note would be it's still too bright. You know, it almost looks like if we were in like a fantasy setting. Let me put it in slow-mo here. Like if we were in a fantasy setting, it almost appears like we're shooting an ice arrow. We're not shooting ice. We're shooting a regular arrow with just kind of like a little trail behind it. So it's a bit too noticeable. For me, pure white or very close to white is too close to ice. So I like a bit more gray to harder to see, to have it feel more like wind. So we're gonna go and do this. We're gonna go back into the material for one last time and make our final adjustment for me, which is drop down the opacity and put it at 20% here, or 0.2, because again, default is 1, so we're multiplying it by a constant of 0.2, and so we're gonna get 20%. And that's pretty much near the final of where I have it right now, where I like it. And I'll show you the final result again one more time. So let's head back over to our showcase area, hit our bow, and then we will target it. And there we go. So it feels feels pretty good to me. Put on slow-mo here. So you can even argue it's still getting close to too much white. You know, it's still a little bit bright, but you can always make an adjustment here. But the subtleness of the curve around the ribbon feels pretty good, and we can even easily change that because we just made the material. There's still two more parts to this. We have the whole particle effect, which we're breaking it down into two parts: the Niagara emitter and the Niagara system. So let's go into that right now. So we made our material. We're pretty happy with the way that it looks. So now we need to make the particle effect. So the actual system that's going to be like, hey, all right, you know, shoot, you know, create, you know, sparks or explosions or whatever we need the effect for. So within here, this is a whole different type of blueprints. So this is all within the Niagara editor, and it is generally node based, but this one has more modules in here, is what they're called, for the particle effect. So if you were to create an empty emitter, actually I think I can just do completely empty. You can see that there's basically nothing in here. So this is what you would get if you were to make a completely empty emitter compared to what we have over here. So there's these different categories, if you will, and these different categories describe how a particle is made. So in the render portion at the bottom here, the render is basically to say, what kind of particle are we making? Is it are we rendering a component? Are we rendering a decal? Are we rendering light? Are we rendering a mesh, ribbon, sprite? You get the idea. So it's like, what are we rendering out here exactly? And then up above, let's go down from the top here. So we have emitter update and emitter spawn. So these take place at different points in time. So emitter spawn, as you can see, is at the creation of basically the particle effect. So this will kind of happen once and then never again. Emitter update is every tick, they say on the CPU. So every time in the engine that there's a tick, this calculation is run. So this is useful for, say, if you want to make a lot of particle effects. So if you need to have a certain rate at which these particles are spawned, you want to have them spawn, say like spawn, you know, 10 or so every tick. And there's different kinds of rates that you can do. There's spawn rate, and then there's also a burst. So spawn like a bunch of particles at one time every so often. There's that option as well. So this was mainly used for kind of determining a spawn rate and then sometimes the state of the emitter, but that's a little bit overhead for today, but we'll keep that simple there. Then you have the particle spawn, which means once the particle is created, there's different modules that are in here that set up the initial values of that particle in here. So basically, if I were to use this as an example here, it's gonna be, let me hide my camera here so you can kind of see. Might be a little bit small on your screen, but actually, let me just do this here and kind of blow it up for you a little bit. So you can see over here that there's several different kinds of attributes that we can describe on this object here. So the point attributes are your most used ones. So we're describing how long does this particle live for? How is the color being determined? How is the position being determined? And what is the mass? And most of these, you can either set them to nothing or directly set them, or you can create a, let me go back to fit the canvas, or you can create your special, a custom parameter. So like a variable. So you can be like, well, and you can plug in other systems in there. So like, well, I want this particle to live for as long as, you know, this other thing is going on. So the lifetime of this other thing. So if I'm describing like an explosion, it's like, well, I only want embers going as long as there's an explosion going on or whatever, or dust being kicked up as long as the initial part of the explosion is going. You can determine settings like that. But going back over to this, bring this out over here. So we also have, sprite attributes. If we're dealing with like a sprite, so like a typical, like a 2D card in space, how big is it? What direction is it facing? And then how it handling its UV mode, which that's a little bit more complicated to explain. So I'm just gonna skip it for right now. Mesh attributes. So if we're dealing with like a 3D object, again, what's the scale of it? Is it uniform? So are we going to scale all the sides evenly, or are we kind of, is it longer than it is wide? All those sort of things. And then the last one that's important to us is the ribbon attributes. So for a special kind of ribbon material, if I were to go into the default ribbon material here, let me hide my camera so you can see. Oh, whoops, that changes my view too. All right, we'll bring this back over here. So default ribbon. Maybe if I just type in ribbon, it'll find it. Yeah. So this is your kind of typical default ribbon material. So it's kind of like a big square, and then has like a gradient that falls off. When you create a new ribbon renderer material, this is the default material that is included with it. That's one of the engine made materials that comes with Unreal. So we want a little bit more control of that. Like I said, I like it to be a bit more tailored. I don't want to see these hard edges, so that's why we're using our own material. So I'm gonna close that. Go back to where we were. Spawn. So with the ribbon here, we can have one of the most important things is the width. So how wide is this ribbon? So again, relatively small object, so I have it set at 5, which is a little bit wider than our actual arrow, but because we are basically cutting off the edges of it, because we're feathering that away, because again, we're basically, this used to be the square before, but now you can basically hardly see it. You can't see the edges. We're taking away a lot of it, so it's okay to kind of make it a little bit bigger here. And then basically how does this face camera? You can basically tell it to basically always face the camera, so it always looks like it's flat. So if you were to turn if this hand is the camera and this hand is the object, it would always kind of like appear to you. It would kind of rotate and face you by default. And that happens with every other kind of a particle effect that's like 2D. So if you ever see like a burning barrel or a fire or something like in a game, you can always just kind of like rotate and turn around there. You can kind of see it'll always kind of face you. It's to imply the illusion of depth without there actually being depth there. Because trying to render out 3D stuff is really expensive. So we do all these little tricks with 2D cards and layer it in a way that it's hard to tell the difference for you. And then twist mode is if we want the ribbon, do we want to kind of twist, so it kind of has like a spiral look. So anyway, go ahead and delete that. Go ahead and fix this. Fit to canvas. So with our particle effect here, we have all the modules that we need here. So going through there, I'm going to add in so you can actually see our particle effect here playing. I'm just going to have it go up. Where is it? Just have it go a little bit faster. It's going to be hard to see in camera when we change the opacity to like 1 again. There you go. So you can kind of see this is the viewport, the representation of the particle effect in here. And right now, in order to have it be smooth, I'm having a spawn rate of about 100. So basically, every tick that goes on in here, I'm having 100 ribbon particles spawn. And that's important because the less you have, so I go to 1, you don't really see anything. If I go to 5, the reason why you're not seeing anything is because we have a extremely low lifetime set. I have it set over here to 0.2, because the longer you have your ribbon material going out for, there's more particles you're going to be drawing. So if we're doing a spawn rate of 5, and we have a lifetime of 1, so about 5 every second, look, we have about 5 particles existing the whole time. If I go to a 50, now we have 50 particles being spawned, and it's pretty smooth. And this might be nice if you're trying to do like, if you have like a plane or whatever, and you want to get those under the wing kind of streamers going on there. This could be a great use for that. You just make the kind of lifetime even longer, and it'll just kind of generally follow where you go. But again, we're shooting an arrow. We don't want it for that long, and I kind of don't want to spawn this many particles. So having a short lifetime is actually a big benefit for us here. So I'm gonna go back to where I had it, which I think was at like 0.2. So really short here, and I didn't even change the spawn rate here. So it's still spawning 50 particles a second, basically. You know, it's the ticks, but they're only lasting for 0.2 of a second here. So the math kind of maths out, and where you have 50 divided by 0.2, you're gonna get 10 particles. So all of this kind of just, you know, works and lines up here. So I don't remember my exact value. I had it before. I think I can, is it the green with it? Value determined by, yeah, I had it on 100. So there's also a, excuse me, let me grab a little bit of water. Gotta get used to talking for a long time. So the benefit of having more particles spawning for a ribbon material is that it's going to look smoother. Where if I have a lesser amount, again, let's do half, it's not going to look as smooth. It's only here because we have a fixed rate of because we added a velocity so that you see it, but it's gonna look smooth. So I'm gonna go back to 100, and then, excuse me, we're gonna get rid of this velocity here because we don't need it. But before I get to that, so I set my lifetime and I've set my ribbon width. So again, I can set this to a bigger number, and it's gonna be a lot wider. We're gonna have it at 5. And then the particle state is one in the particle update. So this is called every frame per particle. So the modules in here will update values based on what we set in here. So the particle state is one that you need to have in every particle effect, and where you can see it manages the age and the lifetime of it. So it's every frame it's calculating, all right, I lived for 1 frame, deduct how much time is left on my lifetime, and then if that elapsed, you know, kill the particle. Else, if it's if there's collision on this particle, and if it collides with anything, that kills the particle as well. This would also basically calculate that as well. So oh, I collided with something, I need to die. So there's a lot of things with that particle, but you always need to have one of those. Same thing with the solve forces and velocity. So this basically just calculates the physics of the particle, so you always need to have it. But the important thing that we can do here is the color. So remember how in our material here, we have this particle color node, and it's an input data. So we're like, all right, if I click it, oh, I can't input anything here. I can only write a description. Well, because this is not where you input that data. You're inputting that in the particle effect. So when we call it the particle here, excuse me, this is the particle color that we're determining here. Can you see the whole module here? There's a bit more. This is all the alpha, so like the opacity of it over lifetime. But if we wanted to say make this darker, if I said before, oh, it's too bright, I can make it darker, so a little bit less visible here. So, or I can make it any other color. You can see it's changing it over here. So with all that, let us go back into our particle effect here. Go ahead and hit save. Why not? Sure, I'll check it out. No big deal. And then let's head back into our our little test scene here. Hit the bow. Go ahead and target this. Oh, whoops! I forgot to take off the velocity there. Let me go ahead and do that. It's like, why is it going up there? Duh. Go ahead and change that. Yeah, errors. So now let's go back into our particle effect here. Put up the bow, and then let's go over to our testing area, and we'll be able to see that it should be a little bit less visible than before. And some of this we can also determine if it's still too bright, then we can also lessen the amount of particles being drawn. This will help with it as well, because again, we're having multiple translucent objects kind of draw over the top of each other. So when you have multiple white things on top of each other, even if they're just a little bit white, because it's translucent, it's going to act additive. So it's going to add them all together, being a larger sum than the total of its parts, or whatever that saying is. So go ahead and bring this down to, let's say, let's do 45. Because again, less particles that are being drawn, more performant, which is always good in my book. And if you can get the same look of what you're trying to go for with less, always do that. So we'll go ahead and load into this. My bow. And yeah, so a little bit less noticeable here. So, but otherwise for the bow, that's pretty much it. It's very simple effect, nothing too complicated. But it's, even though it's not a a super complicated thing, we're not doing explosions or anything that requires multiple particle effects, because you have to keep in mind here is that there are particle emitters, and then there are Niagara emitters, and then you have Niagara systems. And you can think of it as like a book. So a Niagara emitter is like a chapter in a book. It's a couple of pages or whatever, and it's basically describing a theme or a mood. And then the Niagara system is the whole book, so it's all of those chapters together. And while an emitter, Niagara emitter, only has one emitter node, so you're basically describing the core function of the effect you're going for, the Niagara system is a collection of those emitters together. So we can add multiple emitters, so like, I don't know, let's add confetti. Wow, cool, confetti. So we can have multiple emitters together. And with this, it's a very useful tool to have, because there are so very few things that are just usually one emitter. This happens to be very simple in this case, but say we're doing an explosion, that I've done on previous projects. An explosion is many things. It's not just the fireball that you see in the air. Yes, that's one part of it, but then there's force. So is there dust? What's being kicked up from the ground? Is it dust? Is it gravel? What debris is being kicked up on there? We got to have smoke, you got to have fire, you got to have sparks, you got to have embers. All of these things would be basically different emitters, and then you combine all those emitters together into explosion _01 for your bomb that you're trying to make. So it's there's a lot more that's involved in there. So, but it's always good to start with something simple like this. Or if you're trying to make, sparks are a relatively good option as well to start off with. They're really simple. But yeah, so but for the most part, that's pretty much it. And then the last couple of things here. I see we're already a little bit past the hour here, but that's all right. We'll kind of get close to wrapping up. So we have, and my voice is going away. We have the particle effect made. We have the material for the particle effect made. Now, oh, that's why it's so high. It's at 0.2 there. All right. Well, I think I solved my own problem. But anyway, so we've made the material, we've made the emitter, we've made the particle system. Now we have to integrate it, because before, if I were to have just made those 3 things or 4 things, the material, the emitter, and the system, we haven't integrated it in there. We have to have, it has to happen at certain moments in gameplay. So it's when the bow fires, not when the player maybe has an arrow kind of racked in the string ready to fire. Because if they're moving around, we don't want the ribbon, kind of following the player when the arrow hasn't been fired yet. We have to integrate it into gameplay. So for what we're doing for our system, and this is going to vary everywhere that you work at, however design / your other programmers determined, what they're going to do. Like I said, are we doing a projectile system? Is it a hit scan system? How is damage being calculated, and how are things being played out? So with this, we have to go into the blueprint for all these things. So if we're looking at our 3rd-person character blueprint here, why is it always so zoomed out? All right, let's move the camera here. So this is going to be like a representation of our character holding a bow. So it is in here. If we go into the event graph here, thankfully this is all nicely labeled. This whole section of code here is commented to shoot projectile attack, spawn BP, projectile actor, and set the velocity on the projectile actor. All right. So, here's the start of the event here. There's a sequence, so it's going to do this top section first and then do the bottom. Then after that, what we really care about is kind of 2 things. Is our particle effects being spawned here in this blueprint, and then 2, what's this projectile? So we can determine that we're using a projectile system and it's spawning a projectile class. We need to find which one it is. Well, thankfully, spawn actor right here, and then here's the class that's labeled. And then there's this other emitters and stuff in other settings here, but we know where to go. So if we go to the blueprint, here is our object that is actually being fired. This is in our gameplay ability system, or GAS. So here's the arrow being fired. So all we would have to do basically is, what I would do is you would just basically add a component in here, because we want to add in a Niagara component, our particle effect we made. Just type in Niagara, and then we get Niagara particle system component. You would click that, you would add it in, and then you'd name it, and then you tell it, okay, so here it is in space, so it's right behind the tip of our arrow here, which is exactly where we want it. And now we need to say what particle effect is going to play here. So we're going to use the one that we made, which is Niagara System Arrow Trail. So it's like, okay, so it's going to pick this, put it in the back here, and then we also have this check marked where it's going to auto activate. So basically, when this projectile is spawned, it's automatically going to turn on our particle system here. And thankfully for how this is set up, when it dies, the particle effect is also going to die. So when the arrow finally collides with its target, so that's all set up well, and we don't have to worry about any of our code in here. It should all be, taken care of with that. There are going to be situations where you would have to kind of go in there and be like, okay, make the particle effect visible here, maybe after the object dies, delay by like 0.5 seconds. So if you're going really fast and you had your trail kind of lagging behind, and then you were to tell the arrow here to die, but your trail's super long, then it's all going to disappear and it looks kind of jarring. But thankfully our arrows don't fly that fast here, so with it all dying, kind of just works out. Otherwise, you would kind of say like, okay, don't die when the object you're attached to dies, just kind of delay a little bit and then kind of fade away back into it. So So there's a lot of control that you can do here. So thankfully, again, this is relatively simple and super easy to integrate. So otherwise, I think that's for the most part pretty much it for today. So that's how we're doing our bow and arrow. So I'll go into one last time here now that I fixed the opacity. I forgot that I left it at 1. And go back into our test showcase map here. Go ahead and open up our bow. Head over to our arrow we've been doing, and then fire. You see it's a lot more subtle. Actually, I think I need to revert to the settings I had before here. So I think I need to have the particles back up higher to where I had it. At 0.2, I didn't change anything else there. So let's go ahead and hit save. Yeah, that's fine. And you'll see these things kind of pop up where it's like, do you want to check this out? When you work at a game development studio here, or really anywhere, they're going to have a version of source control. So basically, parts of the project that you can have checked out for you, kind of like books of the library. So if you have something checked out, nobody else can read or work on it. And if as soon as you check it back and somebody else can check it out, then you can't read or do anything with it. So it's a way to kind of control files or whatever, so things don't get overlaid. So if we go right here, there we go. So I have the opacity turned way down low, and it's a real subtle arrow effect here. So just a little bit of motion, but it just catches your eye a little bit here. So again, I think that will probably be it for today. We're already going an hour and 15 minutes. Ooh, even a little longer than I thought. But yeah, so I hope that you all kind of enjoyed this kind of developer diary, developer vlog, behind the scenes. I don't know what exactly to label it, but something a little bit different that you might not see. Just kind of the world of turn that down for you. World of game development that you might not see, but you can kind of appreciate all the details in here. So, because again, I'm just one part of a larger team here, so it's everybody probably can go on for hours on what they want to do or what they're doing on the project. So hopefully that you found this pretty interesting, and maybe we'll do this again in the future. So without further ado, for now, I'll talk to y'all later. And remember, you can check out Noble Legacy. It is on our website at noblelegacygame.com, or you can check out our Discord and other socials, which you can find on that website as well, or also linked down below in whatever streaming platform you're viewing right now, be it Twitch, YouTube, or Kick. So until then, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.